moving right along
Fun.
to the point where we'll be mapping personal responsibility in biosocial space. All right. I don't know much about Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, but at some point I did come across a slogan that they use at least sometimes, which I think expresses pretty well the relationship between between causation and responsibility that I've been talking about. Their slogan is, "It's not your fault that you're in trouble, but it's your responsibility to get out of it." So this is a way of getting away from the linear distribution of blame between society and individual, for example, that common sense is fond of. So we're not going to say that we're not going to say that 20% of your drinking is your fault. It's the originator's fault, because the originator could have decided to do otherwise. And 80% of the blame belongs to society. We're not going to say that, because without knowing it, we have an intuition of something like a multiordinal relationship between fault and responsibility. So what I'm calling causation, I believe AA here calls fault or blame. Let's call it causation. And that's multiordinally at a higher level than responsibility. So that 100% of the fault is biosocial. And you can think of other stuff that can go in there. And 100% of the responsibility is that of the individual. So it adds up to 200%. 100 plus 100 equals 200. Or maybe this is a case of 1 plus 1 equals 1. Because we're not talking about two different worlds here. We're talking about one and the same world with two levels. The level of causation and the level of responsibility. It's not your fault that you're a lush. You didn't cause it. You didn't decide in the womb or something like that. Or when they gave you your first drink at the age of 8, here, have a little rib. Or whatever. But it is your responsibility to get out of it. Given everything that was in place, you could not have done otherwise. So there's no question of the free will of an originator. But now, given new happenings, punishments, threats, influences, education, you can perhaps behave differently in the future. Responsibility to do something. And of course, AA doesn't say it's the response of the isolated sole individual, because AA is a collective of individuals who are helping one another to take responsibility in a matter like this. So I'm going to suggest that the inability to get this simultaneity, this multiordinal simultaneity, the fault and responsibility, is practically definitional of Aristotelian orientation in this regard, or we could say of common sense, or of liberalism, conservatism, individualism, of what in Everywhere They Are in Chains, the Horowitz is called the market hive. So let's zero in on the ism called individualism, because That is probably the most appropriate label here. Let's say that individualism is, we could almost define individualism as this inability to grasp simultaneously the facts of 100% systemic causation and 100% individual responsibility without any sense of paradox or contradiction. It's multiordinality that allows us to escape from the linear illusion of paradox or contradiction here. So now we're going to talk about a problem. Pretty soon I'll be talking specifically about case studies of individual problems. Mainly I'll be talking about Boris's problem. So let's just start talking about Boris. I chose the name Boris because it's not Tom, Dick, or Harry.
And Russians.
So it respects diversity. It embraces diversity in a way which the usual casting in situations like this does not. So we'll say Boris's problem as an individual has absolutely no existence of its own outside of biosocial space. So we can go back to this. The level of fault or causation. Blame isn't even in the picture anymore. We don't even need the word. Forget it. So the level of fault is the level of biosocial causation, and the level of responsibility is the level of agency, individual agency, is the level of responsibility. The individual problem, let's say, here's the problem. Responsibility has to do with one's, the way one deals with or approaches problems. And the problem has absolutely no existence of its own outside of biosocial space. You can't take the individual problems out of biosocial space. We could put it this way. The problem is not at all located inside the individual. Or if we're looking at families, inside of the family. The problem is not at all located inside the individual or family. Rather, let's just talk about the individual. The individual is located inside the problem. The problem is not in you. This is what AA is saying when it says it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. It's saying the problem is not in you. You are in the problem. And you, finding yourself in the problem, can't evade the responsibility of doing something about it. You may be incapable of assuming the responsibility. That's another story. But it isn't possible to evade the responsibility. The individual, we could say, is the level of the system where its problems are experienced. We could say the individual is the level of the experience of biosocial problems. I'm shifting around the way I'm using the word problem. Let's use C. Wright Mill's language of issues and troubles. Remember that? When Mills described politics as the translation of personal troubles into public issues. The individual is the level of the experience of biosocial issues. So I'm responsible, no matter how much help I have, the problem can't be solved without me. No one else can do it for me, even if I get a lot of help. So it's up to me to make use of whatever resources are at my disposal at any given moment. So up here we could put, say, structure. We could put system. put the biosocial. What else? What other labels could we throw up there? Fault. See, a fault here, not in the sense of blame, but in the sense of something going wrong, something not working right. Fault. And down here we have the level of voluntariness, voluntary behavior, individual agency. By the way, this would be the level of the experience. This is the level of experience, hey? There's no experience up here. This is the level of experience. Structure and agency. That's, the name of the famous book by Tony Blair's advisor. What's his name?
Oh, Giddens?
Giddens, yeah. Anthony Giddens. For him it was a paradox, structure and agency. You needed some kind of Aristotelian middle to work it out. But here we don't need paradox and we don't need middles. We're working with extremes, in a sense. Well, not really, because in multiordinality you avoid having to work with the extremes that you find if you put everything on one line. Down here we have decisions. Structures don't make decisions. Human beings make decisions. Now, this is just another way of developing the consequences of the notion that we were exploring in first term, the teaching of emptiness and emptiness of self, that there simply is no inherently existing self, which could be the cause of its own existence or of its own problems or achievements or failures or anything like that. A lot of what I'm saying here comes out of my education and experience as a psychotherapist, and I'm going to be referring to various therapeutic approaches here, but we're not losing for a moment the significance of the social and the political. And that's something you don't often find in the field of psychotherapy.
Gad, if I may just perhaps to illustrate this difference, I read a really good interview between Badiou and Finkielkraut. And they're talking
laughing
about,
already, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They're talking about the problem of immigration and exclusion in France,
right,
and the people without papers.
Right.
Badiou's level of argument was always at the level of structure, system, biosocial. And Finkielkraut's level of argument was always on a voluntary agency, experience, and decision.
Yeah.
So they're actually not talking about...
They're not.
They couldn't talk
because
to each other.
maybe both of them have this linear presupposition that reality is arranged on a line.
Yeah.
And that you can distribute on the line, but you can't actually go there. At some point, I discovered, there are many, many different schools of psychotherapy just in the Anglosphere. And they all work, which immediately makes one a little suspicious. What's going on here? But they're all. Many of them are very interesting in their own ways, and they all develop particular, specific, precise techniques. For example, formulations that are interesting, if not always useful. So there's a school that came out of England called cognitive analytic. You can see what bridges they're trying to build, cognitive analytics. And this is mostly the creation of a guy named Tony Ryle. And I'm not going to tell you about the whole approach, but just about one of the techniques that he uses, because I'm going to adopt it for the purpose of mapping personal problems in impersonal space, or transpersonal space. And this is something that he calls a sequential, diagrammatic, reformulation. I'll never write that on the board again, at least not this year. It's SDR. SDR. So one of the things that a cognitive analytic therapist will do with a client is work out with the client a kind of way of mapping the sequence of events of which the problem consists. So it's sequential, and it's a diagram, and it's a reformulation of the problem in terms of a sequential diagram. So it's going up to the label level, making a diagram there that takes account of temporality, and then takes it back to the object level in order to reformulate reformulate our understanding of the experience of the problem at the object level. And this is supposed to help us to work at the object level with this new understanding. That's translating it into Korzybski terms. So with the client, this is worked out, and I'll give you an example or two, perhaps. All right, I probably won't use Ryle's own examples. I'll use real and fictional examples from my experience. So here's a real example, or at least it's based on fact. So here's a person who is constantly being disappointed in others with whom she is closely related, including her therapist. And it goes back to her experience with her mother, where, as very often in the mother-daughter relationship, at least in retrospect, everything seems to be kind of paradisical, harmonious mother-daughter relationship, where nothing can go wrong. And then all of a sudden, mother becomes the disappointing one, the frustrating one. And the child is left with a feeling of deep disappointment, and one might even say a feeling of betrayal. So we could call this for short, betrayed entitlement. Betrayed entitlement. Cognitive analytical therapy, if I remember correctly, works basically by labeling personal problems under 3 different rubrics, and they can overlap. One of them is the trap. A lot of problems are traps. Now, the structure of a trap is you can't get out of it. No matter where you go in the trap, you always end up where you started. And where you start in a psychodynamic trap is in a core state. That's what Ryle calls it, a core state. So the core state for Indira is betrayed entitlement. It's not a happy state. It's kind of depressed, and it's kind of paranoid. Because once you're betrayed, you expect to be betrayed again. And when you expect to be betrayed again, you are betrayed again, all other things being equal. So working with Indira, Marcia, and she was consulting with me. Among the 3 of us, we worked out this diagram. So here's the core state. I put it in a circle first. So you try and get away from it. When you're not feeling good, you try and get away from the bad feeling. You try to go to a place where you'll feel better. So Indira engages in an anxious search. I wonder where I have to write it. I don't have to write every word on the board. She engages in an anxious search for someone to trust. Okay? We'll call it search. So from the time that she's 5 or 6 years old, all right? It's sequential and it's repetitive. She looks for someone to trust. Eureka. She finds someone that she can idealize in something like the same way that she idealized her pre-betrayal mother. Euphoria. But then the suspicion arises. How is this possible? How is this possible? And then there's a search for untrustworthiness. A search for signs of untrustworthiness. And of course, sooner or later, the search will succeed. One will find some signs of untrustworthiness. Now, in a way, we're talking about the human condition, but for Indira, whatever she finds that could be taken as a search of untrustworthiness is not minimized, it's magnified. So there's a magnification of the significance of the signs of untrustworthiness. And at the same time, there's what the Freudians and Adlerians call a secondary gain. Because one has developed, and one knows that one has developed, a really incisive intelligence in terms of judgment of character. So Indira knows that she's an excellent judge of character, and she has indeed developed a kind of ability to judge character in a certain, perhaps skewed manner that has become precious to her, part of her sense of self in a positive way. So in the trap there are snags, also another kind of problem Ryle calls a snag. A snag is a subtle negative aspect of goal. A subtle negative aspect of goals. The goal is to get away from the core state of betrayed entitlement. But the snag is that if one got away with that, one would also lose one's incisive character judging ability, which has become an important sense, part of one's positive self-image. Anyway, the search ends in success. There's a bit of a paradox, because I've succeeded in finding at least the potential for betrayal in my own children, in my husband, in my coworkers, in my Tai Chi teacher, and finally in Marcia. So the price, however, to be paid for success is that one is back at the core state. So whatever you do, you end up back in the core state, and that's why it's a trap. So the therapeutic idea is that by working this out with the client, you work it out together with the client, and you create this SDR map together, and the client walks out with the map. So this time she has a map. So the question is, how many more times is she going to be able to do that, now that she has the map in place at the label level? Well, there's no answer to that. It's a fine risk. How do we say it in French? A fine risk. Another type of problem is a dilemma. So there's snags, traps, and dilemmas. Those are, just for fullness of reference, those are Ryle's labels or theoretical crutches. Okay, so now we come to Boris. Boris is a creature of my imagination. But Boris is maybe just as real, if not more real, than Indira in the case of having an issue or a problem or a set of issues and problems which are typical, at least of males in our culture. Typical of typical males in our culture insofar as it's typical. Okay. So, after I've talked about Boris for a little while, you'll feel as if you know him. Because you do. So Boris walks in, and therapists and healthcare practitioners generally like to use the term presenting problem. Because we know that the problem you present with is just a kind of entry point or ruse. It'll be a while before you get to the underlying problem. The presenting problem is disorganized. Now let me just hand this out, because I did this so that you can follow, so I don't have to use the board. Boris's
Alternative
presenting problem is disorganized. I'm disorganized. I feel like such a scatterbrain. I should be looking for work, but I'm not looking for work. I can't. But metamodal pattern is operating here when he says he should be, but he can't. It's a modal operator. There's two different modal operators. There should be and can't, but we can focus on the can't. And so the challenge to that is what stops you? Well, what stops you? We're not going to say, well, have you tried this? Well, have you tried that? Well, why don't you do this? Well, why don't you do that? Because he's already told you he can't. So the question is, what stops you? And that's not what would it be like if you could, because that's a bit of, it's not respectful at this particular moment. So it's like, what stops you? Obsessing about past failures. He's obsessing about past failures. Okay. So the core state is worthlessness. We've seen that before. We've talked about that before. The core state is worthlessness. I'm a failure. I'll never amount to anything. And the emotional state is depressed. And the arrow to the right seeks relief, excessive drinking. It works. In fact, my brother Eagle said to me, if I could learn to drink 1 Campari soda a day, all my problems would be over.
That's not very excessive.
And of course, not of course, but in Boris's case, this leads to revulsion. And the revulsion leads back into the core state, right? I'm worthless. I'll never amount to anything. I'm a failure. Depressed. It's like, do I have a great big F stamped on my forehead? Boris says.
No.
Okay. Now, another thing here that can happen is he seeks relief. Fortunately, he has a girlfriend. Isn't Boris lucky? He has a girlfriend. And he can seek relief from the girlfriend. And he does. He seeks relief from the girlfriend in any number of many different ways. That's what girlfriends are for. Seeks relief from the girlfriend. But she can't provide the appropriate quantity and quality of relief. And he blames her, of course. So the next arrow is he's aggressive to the girlfriend. He mistreats her. He's aggressive. And of course, these two are going to go together. Often when he's drunk, he'll be aggressive. So I should actually make a little connection between these two modes of relief because they are interactive. Gets drunk, says, oh, I'm going to get my girlfriend. But, he's too drunk to treat her humanely, and it doesn't work. And he blames her. So he's aggressive to the girlfriend, and he experiences shame. Yes, the shame of the abuser. He experiences that. And, that works in with the revulsion that he feels at his excessive drinking. So we have the shame and revulsion going together. I should maybe put that on the diagram too. Well, there it is. That's quite a trap. Now, some of Ryle's diagrams show exits. I've shown the exit at the left. Since this is a fictional case, we can provide an exit, if we wish. So the exit is going to come from therapies. It could come from a follower of Albert Ellis working on the core belief there of worthlessness. Or it could come maybe from a cognitive analytic therapist. He might have to go to England for that. And he walks out with this map and he's like, oh my God, am I going to go through this again? And maybe is able to make some other choice, decision, assumption of responsibility. Or maybe he goes to an AA meeting just long enough to hear, it's not your fault that you're in trouble, but it's your responsibility. to get out of it. And he doesn't want to have anything to do with AA, but he walks out of there with that slogan reverberating in his mind and, you know, takes various steps. Okay, but let's say let's look at the map a little bit. Let's look at the map a little bit and take it a little bit further than I've got it on the diagram. It's his responsibility to do something to structure his time. Disorganization means unstructured time. You know, back in the 60s, 70s, there was a school of psychotherapy that was very influential in the States. It's now almost completely forgotten. In fact, I'm going to have difficulty remembering its name. Oh, it was called transactional analysis. In fact, you may have heard of its founder, Eric Berne, who wrote a book called Games People Are Playing. Nice little book. Very complicated, though. So according to Berne, anyway, the question of time structure, the question of structure of time is a major, major factor in personal problems in capitalist civilizations. And it's part of his problem. You can see it right at the top there in the presenting problem. And it's his responsibility, you know, if that exit works, he's going to be doing something to structure his time, looking for work, learning whatever skills might be needed or helpful in the situation, thinking about what's best for him in the situation of being an unemployed wage slave, you know, who's got to look for work. No one else is going to do it for him. So it's 100% his responsibility. He didn't cause capitalism. He didn't create unemployment. He didn't invent alcoholic beverages, etc., etc., etc. In this situation, however, there's no one who's going to get him out of this. Since he hasn't joined AA and his girlfriend is no help, it's up to him and him alone. And yet, he knew this from the start. He knew it, but he wasn't doing anything about it. And why? Because he was blaming himself. He was blaming himself. He was, as Ellis puts it, downing himself, self-downing, depressing himself with these ideas and feelings and images of worthlessness and of being a failure. And he's so preoccupied with those that he ends up constructing his reality something like this. I'm not doing what I should be doing because I'm a useless, lazy, worthless slob. Well, where's that going to get him? Rather than saying to himself, I'm not getting anywhere because I'm distracting myself and blocking my own agency with those ideas. So in therapy, I'm changing the story a little bit. In therapy, he gets better because he's working with a Ellis, follower of Ellis, on the idea of worthlessness. And he understands there is no self that can be rated, etc., etc., etc. And he gets to feeling a lot better, but he still can't shake it, because he's developed a new twist. He's developed a new twist. What kind of person would do that to himself? Blame himself that way. So he blames himself for blaming himself. What kind of a loser is that? Someone who's always calling himself a loser. What kind of a loser is that? Multiordinal. So it takes on a kind of multiordinal, self-referential, vicious circular structure. There must be something wrong with me. So I'm defective, weak, etc., etc., etc. So you got to work on it more. You got to work on it more. And let's say after a while he's successful enough to exit, look for work, find a job, but then after a while he regresses. After a year or two or three, maybe he loses his job again and finds himself right back where he was in the first place. I'm telling the story that way so I can pursue it further. This is where I should tell you about another school of therapy that could intervene at this point, but not likely. Yeah, it's happening in North America now too. One of the popular schools of therapy these days is called narrative therapy. Now, there are many different approaches in narrative therapy. Some are a lot more socially conscious than others. And what we're looking for here is a socially conscious variant of narrative therapy. And this was actually originated in Australia by someone named Michael White. Now has many followers in the Anglosphere. His outfit is called the Dulwich Centre in Adelaide, Australia. And he has a collaborator in New Zealand named David Epstein. And I'll just read you in no particular order some stuff that rather than look through my voluminous notes in the box in my closet, I just went directly to Google. When people turn to therapy for assistance, they have often reached a point where they believe there is something wrong with them. Something wrong with me. I am the problem. The problem is in me. Or that something about them is problematic. By this point, the problem has become internalized. People assume the problem is a facet of their nature or inner self. The problem has thus become fused with the person's identity. I am worthless, useless, lazy, etc., etc. I am. A problem of identity. Loss of the I, the immersion of the I into this particular I am. This narrative stance, in narrative therapy, assumes that people can most easily examine the effects of problem-saturated stories of their lives when a discussion is conducted via externalized conversations. So one of the key features of this brand, anyway, of narrative therapy is externalizing the problem. So the therapist spends a lot of time engaging in externalizing the problem and asking questions which are externalizing questions, which treat the problem as something that is outside of the person. So that, to come back to my language, the person would be inside the problem, rather than the problem being inside the person. Externalizing establishes a context where people experience themselves as separate from the problem. A simple example. This process often begins simply. For example, during an initial session, a client may comment that he feels he has a problem with making major decisions in his life. It's a little bit like Boris's disorganization. The consulting therapist may ask externalizing questions such as, so, indecision has made it difficult for you to arrive at certain decisions in your life. You're using the nominalization, decision, putting it outside the person as if it were something acting on the person from the outside. How long has indecision made it difficult for you to arrive at certain decisions? How long has indecision been influencing your life? What strategy does indecision employ to get you off kilter and unable to make up your mind? The therapist has used the term indecision in an externalized manner and will determine if this or another term fits best for the client. This approach is quite unique within a Western culture that values a scientific medical model that situates problems within individuals' character. After a while, Michael White discovered Foucault and sort of built Foucauldian formulations into his therapeutic discourse. But he originated this before he discovered Foucault. Externalizing problem discourse enables people to separate from the dominant stories that have been shaping their lives and relationships. In doing so, persons are able to identify previously neglected but vital aspects of lived experience. aspects that could not have been predicted from a reading of the dominant story. In Korzybskian terms, you separate from the dominant stories at the label level so that you can identify at the object level previously neglected aspects of experience, come back and reformulate at the label level in a way that makes it possible to go in somewhat different directions, diverging from the dominant story. And now on the matter of responsibility, narrative therapy insists that it's certainly important for people to take responsibility for addressing problems in their lives, but the narrative approach attempts to decouple the effects of blame and shame from the act of taking responsibility for one's problems. In other words, well, I won't go back to that. The process of externalization allows for the separation of blame and responsibility, which is just what I did at the top of the hour. To separate blame and responsibility by thinking of problems as external entities that invite, coach, or trick us into particular responses, etc., etc., etc. With blame and shame for a problem's existence decoupled from the desire to take responsibility for one's actions, the narrative literature maintains that therapeutic space is opened up whereby a person can feel more empowered to create and choose preferred ways of responding to the influence of the problem or constraint. So that Boris, for example, when he hears that voice, that internal voice say, oh, let's just go have another drink, you know, has a different way of responding to that. But that's not enough either. It's not enough for the narrative therapy approach either. The Dulwich Centre and allied people in Australia and New Zealand are very much concerned with biosocial causation in term problems. And the externalizing approach, the externalizing questions are perfect for drawing some attention to the higher level of biosocial causation. So here we have the level of responsibility, and we have, and up here we have the biosocial causation. And the externalizing question actually puts the problem at this higher level. So that I am in the problem, puts the problem at the higher level. Now at higher level, I'm not going to be able to change biology or society, but I am going to be able to loosen and alter my relation to biology and society. By the way, I put biology and society together in a way that the Dulwich School doesn't, for my own theoretical reasons, which you may be able to guess from previous discussions. The Dulwich Centre are very much interested in problems of Aboriginal peoples, for example, in Australia and New Zealand, and in the problems of prisoners, and in problems of domestic violence. So they've done a lot of work with domestic violence, with Aboriginal issues, and with prison issues. And Australia and New Zealand are quite unique as therapeutic schools from that point of view, as far as I know. So let's follow that up a little bit with this second diagram, which is what I've used in the past. Which brings together the two levels. Now inside the circle in the middle you see the SDR of Boris's problems that we've already looked at.
Thank you.
Okay, so if I were doing narrative therapy, and I'm sure that a lot of narrative therapists would approve of this, go along with it at least to some extent themselves. We would look at the causation of Boris's problems. We wouldn't just be looking at responsibility. Let me say a little bit first about why. Okay? We would say that any therapy which stops short of a full externalization of the problem is part of the problem. Now, Boris can exit after cognitive analytic therapy or after working with Albert Ellis on self-esteem. But, you know, if he doesn't regress, somebody else will. More than likely, he'll regress and get back into it again. And if he doesn't, somebody else will. There's always more clients for the therapeutic profession. There's no shortage of clients, and the demand is not decreasing for therapeutic services. Because any therapeutic achievement which doesn't also go to fully externalizing the problem, in other words, developing an understanding of the external sources of the problem in political institutions and in cultural discourses, it contributes to the reproduction of the problem. Because the elements on the outside here don't go away when you've solved the individual problem. They're still there. They're still in place. So they will continue to bring the biosocial down into the personal. If not in Boris, then in others. So from this point of view, the therapeutic process is actually, as Marx would have put it, a haven in a heartless world, the sigh of the oppressed, and contributes to the continuation of the system rather than to its transformation. By avoiding critique of the system as it's operating in individuals' lives, as systems are operating in individuals' lives, therapies contribute to the reproduction of the problem. Just as the priest, the predecessor of the therapist, contributed to the reproduction of oppressive social systems by attributing our problems to lack of faith in God, original sin, etc., etc. Individual and family therapists must work hard to keep these factors out of consciousness. They have to work hard to deny the necessity for fuller understanding of systemic causation, avoiding the reality that the healing of society and self are inseparable. At the end of the day, at the bottom line, where the rubber hits the road, the healing of society and self are inseparable. So the individual being helped allows the system to go on. Maybe this particular individual is fixed, but the system goes on causing the problem for others, generation after generation. And at the level of the criminal law, one's understanding of extenuating circumstances, you see, also blocks this kind of understanding. It's very humane and liberal and progressive to take extenuating circumstances into account, but that works with a linear rather than with a multi-ordinal orientation. You can see that our study of general semantics, especially in relation to multi-ordinality, is very helpful to us at this point in dealing with this material. If you couldn't see it until I said that, you can see it now. So now we look at the second chart. Let's start at the top. Economic system. Some call it capitalism. But if you don't want to use the C word with a client, you know, after all, this client could be a tea partier. You don't want to exclude. You don't want to have to get involved in ideological disputation with the client right away. This is why there's no political discussions in the Alcoholics Anonymous movement. AA is avoiding the fate of general semantics, which was destroyed by the debate about the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm. Really?
Yeah, among other things. Psychedelics and the Vietnam War, but they were like part of the same cultural conjuncture. Well, the economic system is what causes unemployment. And it's unemployment that causes the destructuration of time. When you're if you've ever been unemployed, we all have because we're academics. So if you've ever been unemployed, you know that when there is no time structure, you can easily, now we're down past the boundary between causation and responsibility. We're down to the level of disorganization and not looking for work or not doing something. Maybe not brushing your teeth, maybe not getting out of bed, right? Destructuration. Okay. So, hey, Boris looks at this and he can really see very clearly that the disorganization is not in him. It's not simply a personal characteristic of Boris. It's not as simple as that either, but I've got other complicating factors around the side, and we'll get to them all. He's living in a capitalist system. So we could think, well, okay, if I was living under a brutal Soviet dictatorship, I wouldn't be unemployed, but I wouldn't be free to speak my mind about, the liquidation of the kulaks or whatever. But we won't go there either. Now, as far as the drinking is concerned, we go over to the right and we see cheek by jowl, the advertising industry and the liquor industry. Two very powerful external factors that are involved in the situation, to say the least. And then we have another arrow down to the bar culture. I actually wrote there, a haven in a heartless world. So we've got the bar culture down there, a haven in a heartless world. Now look at the connection between destructuration of time, anomie, which is lack of community, among its other meanings, lack of community, isolation. The bar culture, then, is positively fed by the advertising industry and the liquor industry, and negatively fed by anomie, the lack of community, individual isolation. Where can Boris go when his girlfriend has let him down? Right? Where can he go?
They're not open late at night, though.
Okay, so here we have an arrow that leads to seeking relief, excessive drinking. Okay, so why is that? Now Boris can see, we're using his visual sense here, he can see that. He takes this map out with him, not just map number 1. He takes this map out with him too. He's got a map of the biosocial causation that's involved in his issues. Now over to the side here we have genes, etc., and a question mark. Susceptibility to alcohol. Okay. Because you could say lots of people are exactly Boris's situation and they don't seek relief in excessive drinking, or if they drink excessively, it has no effect on them. They can drink and drink and drink and drink and drink and not move a hair. Right? We know such types. They're very offensive, but they are out there. So we can say that there is a genetic susceptibility to alcohol. Here's where I'm more radical than the Michael White people. I wouldn't put that inside the person. I would put that outside the person. So that's why I talk about biosocial causation instead of simply social causation. And in the second last issue of the New Yorker, our man Malcolm Gladwell has a really interesting article about drinking and the different cultural forms of drinking. He's Canadian. Originally.
Alumnus of Trinity College U of T.
Okay, so he's describing there, it's really very interesting, extremely different ways of reaction to alcohol among different ethno-cultural groups. So we could put that out on the side here also in terms of susceptibility to alcohol. He describes a tribe, I guess it was, that he fell in with in South America who drink extremely powerful liquor for 48 hours straight.
Wow.
And did anyone read the piece? And all they do is they fall asleep. There's no other negative consequences of excessive drinking. And assuming that they're not significantly biologically different, this is just because of the way in which one is expected to behave when one is drunk in a particular culture. You talk to the Irish about it. and you'll get the full story. Do you know why the paddy wagon is called a paddy wagon, by the way? Or do they still call it a paddy wagon? Do you know what the paddy wagon is? It's a wagon where they take people away, the cops.
Yeah.
You know? It's called a paddy wagon because they rounded up drunken Irishmen
Yeah.
in that wagon.
And then a generation later, it was driven by drunken
That's right.
So that's progress.
That's progress indeed.
And then just following the thing, like when my first teaching job at Brock, one of the students died, like they were drinking, like just from drinking.
Yeah, this can happen.
Alcohol
Sure.
poisoning.
Yeah, they don't. I mean, they were doing the chugging, right?
Barbarian.
But so that doesn't happen. They just fall asleep, or they want. Like, I mean, that's just.
They
weird.
just fall asleep. You can read Gladwell's story.
Yeah.
It's a ritualized thing. Everyone knows exactly what they're going to drink. People feed each other alcohol. They have a certain cultural routine they go through. They do it for 48 hours straight. And you know, before we Jews started assimilating quite as much as we are now, it was quite rare to find a Jewish alcoholic. You could find it, but it was quite rare because the Jewish treatment of alcohol was mostly wine on Friday night or a little whiskey once after Sabbath services, a quick shot, and that was it. Anyway, nowadays there's just as many Jewish alcoholics as us, so that's progress too. One of the pioneers of Jewish alcoholism in Canada was my friend Larry Zolf. He was a real pioneer of fall on your face Jewish drunk. And you know, part of the culture also is that we laugh about it. That's also part of it. I mean, we just did. We do. Okay, so much. Oh, and then there's the fact that alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, which I have there on the side. So that's not in the person. If you ask yourself seriously, well, what is in the person, you're going to end up with very little or nothing. And we're back to the Buddhist teaching of emptiness, but we don't have to go there just now. So the treatment of the girlfriend, okay, and of the drinking. Down here we have the discourse of masculinity. This is not an institution like the advertising industry or the liquor industry, which are, by the way, also discourses. But the discourse of masculinity, I suppose, which also has its associated industries, but it's primarily a discourse in the sense of ideas about a man being able to handle his liquor. A man can handle his liquor. And a man takes no guff from a woman. And a man out of work is not a man. And we could go on, but if you put those three together, then we can see the discursive effects in the aggression to the girlfriend, the shame, the self-blame that's involved with the drinking and the aggression towards the girlfriend. The Dulwich Center works a lot with abusive men, and what they do with an abusive man is to externalize it. So it's a discourse of masculinity. They'll ask externalizing questions like, well, when did this discourse of masculinity first begin interfering with your life in this way? And how long do you think you'll be able to tolerate continuing to allow the discourse of masculinity to interfere with your relationships with women and stuff like that? So you can see there how the language of causation and blame, although multiordinally separated, are also working together in order to bring about positive change and to induce a feeling of responsibility. Okay. And now on this side, feeding into the economic system and in turn being fed by the economic system, we have the discourse of individualism. And this is where some of the work we've done before on the self is relevant. Person with less is less of a person. Person with less anything. A person with less ability to drink. A person with less ability to not take guff from a woman. A person with a lower paying job. A person with no job. A person with less of anything. A person with less character. A person with a thinner content of character, to quote Martin Luther King, is less of a person. You have no one to blame but yourself. You have no one but yourself to blame. No one but yourself you have to blame. No one to blame but yourself you have. in as many different ways as you can repeat it to yourself decade after decade. And a person who loses X is a loser, has a great big L stamped on their forehead. And so that both supports the economic system and is perpetuated by the economic system and feeds directly into the core state of worthlessness. And then down below the discourse, we have the memories of parental criticism. A lot of therapists will get that far, but not take it up to the discourse. So it's important to, I think, to recognize the contributions of one's innocent parents here. Because they're innocent. They're as innocent as you are. And yet they have contributed to the situation by by repeating to you ever since you're in kindergarten, that you have no one but yourself to blame, and you'll never amount to anything, and you're going to end up just like your Uncle Mo, and all that kind of stuff. Now, I'm told that among the younger generation of parents, this kind of intervention has become much subtler. I'm not sure, though, how fundamentally different it is. It's probably substantially more confusing, actually, than the older direct attacks. So down here we have some bio-causation again, genes, again, feeding into this organization. Maybe some people are biologically less energetic. My parents tell me that I did a lot of lying around in the crib when I was a baby. Just temperamentally a lower degree of energy. Until someone came along to pinch me on the cheek and tell me how cute I was, and then I would wake up to give them their walking papers. You can't believe that, eh, Sean? Well, I'm sort of making it up a little bit.
Terrible if you're lying around in the crib.
That's right.
You should have known you should have been forever.
Hey, that's
contemplating.
that's nothing. Whenever even the slightest thing annoyed me, I just burst into tears.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's kind of sweet.
Yeah.
That's hyperactive.
Oh, I was that too.
So now, in this latest version, I added this kind of amoeba-like thing at the bottom left, and this I get from Dick Cheney. Because this is also very important. Also from his point of view, there
Well, that's Rumsfeld.
unknown unknowns. Rumsfeld.
Yeah.
Unknown unknowns. Inside and outside the skin. Inside and outside the skin. Unknown unknowns. Okay, so now I walk out with this one, with this map. Now, as a task, I've never assigned a task on this, but I was thinking, what kind of task could I assign on this? So it'll be a bit like the task that I assign in first term on an achievement. For those of you who are not here, which is all but one, only Shannon was there in first term.
Yeah.
Okay, so you all will recall that in first term, shortly after I discussed the event level, I assigned this task of selecting some achievement of yours, and then listing all the things that had to happen, not all the things, but some of the things that had to happen in order for that achievement to be possible. So then you got maybe 5 things that had to happen in order for you to be able to have that achievement. And then take each one of those and make a list of 5 things that had to have happened in order to make that one happen. And as you do this, you realize how gross a simplification it is and how much you're leaving out. Because really, in order to make a complete list, you'd have to go to in-doesn't-it. You wouldn't be able to stop short of going all the way to in-doesn't-it. And, you know, when people thank God, then maybe in part it's this kind of understanding that's at work in their thinking, which is thanking. Heidegger, thinking is thanking. Denken is dunking. But whenever you see something by Heidegger that's just a little bit too pious, you draw a small swastika beside it. I've started doing that, so if you come across a small source paper in a library book, it's mine.
That's mine. You've been doing one mine.
What'd you say, John?
You've done a couple in mine.
Oh, ooh, you were wondering who did that? Okay, so for this one, we could say identify a character flaw of yours. We can all easily think of a character flaw, and then we could go through the same operation with the character flaw and end up drawing a map like this for you.
I'm having difficulty.
Character flaw would relate to. Well, there it is, right there.
If I'm actually perfect, it's not a flaw.
So really, a character flaw. Well, can you give an example so we know what they are?
Why don't you give an example?
Oh, okay.
No, never mind. You find a character flaw. You can if you wish.
I'm thinking.
Right.
Seriously, I need to know what a character flaw is. Like,
Character flaw?
intensely stubborn is a plus.
You're not going to win with Shannon.
No, I'm the same.
It's like a good thing.
I'm the same way. I'm really impatient with people a lot of the time. No, seriously, the whole patience thing is a performance. It's an act. I learned
Okay,
to be
so we
patient.
put impatience in there or something like that. And you diagram what kind of difficulties that gets you in your life. And no matter how much struggle you engage in with it, you sort of end up with it again. And then you draw the biosocial map around it. So that could be the task relating to this part of the course. What do you think?
We're still all working on a character flaw.
No, I found mine. I'm impatient.
I think modesty is for those who have nothing else.
I'm not. No, I still get what they are.
You think modesty is your problem?
No, modesty is for exactly immodesty.
Humility.
I think maybe it's the phrasing of flaw makes it, then you start thinking already in this really personal sense rather than a behavior or something.
Fear. Fear could be a character flaw, right?
Sure.
It can also be a very useful instinct.
Well, it is.
In war, it's called cowardice.
Oh,
You can be
cowardice.
shot. It's more than a character flaw. It's a crime, which can be punished by death, and has been punished by death. It was only recently that the House of Commons passed a resolution sort of wondering whether it was a good idea to shoot all the deserters, 17 and 18-year-old Canadian boys who deserted in World War I because of fear. What's that?
Same thing in France too.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
They passed such a resolution in the Assemblée Nationale.
Yeah.
What do the
And
French think of the fact that the Quebecers also have an Assemblée Nationale? They don't know about it.
They probably don't know about it for
Yeah.
the most part.
Right.
And they find it when they find out, they think it's quaint.
Yeah.
I always wondered how French people think of Québécois.
Well, it's generally actually very positive. I mean, most of the celebrities in France, most of the singers are sort of kitschy Québécois singers. So. Yeah, it's true.
Do they like Jean Leloup there?
Okay, I'm sorry I'm responsible for that digression.
What? I like Jean Leloup. He's fun.
So actually, for the first time, we have time, because I'm done with this. And so we have time to change our minds.
What do you mean?
I mean, we have time to ask questions, discussion, relevant anecdotes, biographical gems, autobiographical gems, yeah?
I like this. I like this idea of the traps.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, I know some of my friends who are alcoholics have a sort of aesthetic approach to it. Mm-hmm. So they choose to be alcoholics to resist submission to work. Like precisely the things that you're talking about as ways out that the psychoanalysis allows for is a healthy relationship to work and to family. Well, alcoholism can be a way of resisting submission to both the precisely
Resistance. So we could put alcoholism as a culture of resistance in there. Yeah, sure. That's actually pretty important, I think, for a lot of people.
I mean, it's because they are degrees of submission. So you feel that you have agency as an alcoholic because you're doing it to yourself rather than someone else doing it
Right.
to you.
But it could also just be a post hoc rationalization.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
And there's also some truth to it, but you know, this is a problem from a from an advanced socialist point of view, with all sorts of forms of resistance that end up invigorating the established order. Sometimes I wonder whether there's any form of resistance that doesn't end up invigorating the established order. But, you know.
I was thinking about what you said a moment ago about the culture surrounding alcoholism, and also governing expected behavior while drunk. And you said ask the Irish, so I thought about the Irish. Because I have sort of an insider-outsider perspective. Obviously, I didn't grow up there. I grew up here, and I also come from a family that was notable for drinking surprisingly little. But there were a few alcoholics on the family tree, which might partially account for that. At any rate, there is this very, very clear expectation, if any of you have been to Ireland or spent a lot of time among Irish people, about what the act of drinking consists of. It's almost never do you do it alone. There's a system around, like you don't buy your own drinks. Like if there's a certain number of you and the first person buys the first round, then you buy for everyone. And in this way you kind of are able to, it was also traditionally sort of a social safety net kind of system where if all of you knew that one of you was having a little trouble with money at the moment, you kind of just, without him noticing, avoided letting him buy anything.
So solitary drinking would be another form of the English vice?
I'm not sure. Well, they would claim that, but that's the thing. Like, but so even though they're drinking to excess, they don't consider it to be excessive until you start doing it on your own. The other thing to it, however, is such a social activity that the whole idea is good conversation and games and so forth. That there becomes this intense social pressure to drink with the collective. Whereas,
I mean, I experienced that growing up as a Jewish boy in North Winnipeg. The intense social pressure to drink beer.
Well, yeah, I mean,
and I tried. I did my best.
I can't really handle it
I just
either.
forced myself. It just didn't work. I couldn't do it.
Well, that's the thing. If I'm here and I'm with a group of people and I have a glass of wine in my hand, say no one bothers me about have 3, 4 more of them. Just have your wine if you want more, have more, what have you. But I was the last time I was in Ireland was just over a year ago, and I went out with one of my with one of Claire's second cousins who lives in Dublin. He's about my age, and he took me out with a number of his friends from. He's also a student, and they were doing the math, and they were counting how many of them they were and how much money was on them, and they were doing a collection. And I asked to contribute, and they said, no, you're our guest. And they worked it out. Okay, we're a bit short, lads. How are we short? Only enough for 8 pints each. Oh, Jesus, how are we going to pull this off? And they were sincerely concerned that 8 pints each was not enough. And when I volunteered to have fewer and contribute, they would not hear of it. Because the idea that the social fun experience must go on. And but the culture was very, very interesting to get into that sense.
Yeah. Well, if one looked back into Irish history to find the origins of this subculture, let's call it, or cultural theme.
It's definitely a cultural theme.
So how far back would we have to go in order to not find it?
Pretty far back. There's not much to do there. It rains and you grow potatoes.
Yeah.
You tell stories and you get drunk.
Yeah.
Okay.
Music.
Yes.
I'm just speculating that there must have been a time either in early Irish history or before they were even Irish where they had better things to do.
I hope so. Otherwise known as the Family Guy thesis.
I'm gonna Google character flaw. I'm having real trouble figuring out what they are. Did you ever do hypnosis with me on character flaws or something? Because I can't. It's like a blank.
Does anybody ever annoy you?
Well, if you don't like the term character flaw,
No.
Not like. What do you mean?
Like, can you remember a situation where you've been really irked by someone else?
Oh yeah, if they're trying to take up my space, yeah, sure.
Okay,
Usually,
so if you invert that to you needing a
but
certain-
that's a plus. That's like not.
How about your inability to process sarcasm?
That's not character.
Inability to what?
I hate sarcasm.
sarcasm. Yeah. Okay, well, you are manifesting it at this very moment.
What,
but I don't-
sarcasm?
No, the character flaw.
Which is what?
Well,
Stupidity?
I don't know.
I don't
Go ahead, Google.
I do. I don't know what it is. 'Cause
Yeah, but meanwhile, anything else?